I fix broken things, but I don't build software for myself. I build software for other people. Um, in doing that, there's really only one good measure for me about success, and that's they're using it and they're better off for having it available. Um, Between here and there is this constant back and forth with the customer that allows people to let you do the work. I work for Microsoft, admitted bias. I'm pretty expensive, and that means people don't call unless they really have to. I tend to be the last guy. You go through other consultants and pay more money until you eventually end up with me. But getting someone to make the choice and getting them to feel like they're getting their money's worth and allowing you to do the things that they were either unable or unwilling to do at the time involves a lot of communication. And in all of the bad projects I've seen in my life, I've seen a lot, communication is at the very core of why things have gone wrong. Almost always there's the truth out there. When I join a program, I start by talking to people. And in those discussions, I usually find out that somebody knows how to do the right thing, how to make it work, how to fix it, but they are not being heard. But before we go too far down this rabbit hole, let's talk about agile and formal practices. Because agile has really, I'm not going to say taken over, but it's got a very large share of the marketplace now. I was around when agile started, agile with a small a, and it was an option to be more humane in the software process. It's changed a lot since then, and now it's got rules and people have methodologies and there are frameworks, but agile and formal are not incompatible. If you're really interested, I have a couple of papers published on doing agile and formal methodologies together, but at the day-to-day grind of agile, you see people doing stand-ups to improve communication. That's awesome. They have some assumptions though, that people are playing nice. Agile works when there's a collaborative environment to keep everybody well informed. Similarly, stakeholders in an agile environment that have really bought in, they're involved. And communication is lightweight all the time. Unfortunately, I have a biased view of the world. Things don't go well, people don't play nice, and they tend not to stay involved. And that raises up the need to do more stakeholder management. At the bottom of all of this is the truth. And it's going to come up several times over the next hour or so. Getting the truth heard and having it heard well in a way where it's responsibly received and in the context it belongs, it's a trick. People bring their own views to the table. Sometimes the truth is very unclear. Our job is to make it clear. But first, let's talk about the stakeholders themselves. There is more than one kind of stakeholder. I mean, it sounds simple enough, but it gets really complicated really fast. When you start to dig into who they are, there's a whole litany. This is just sort of a sampling of the radius around the project. You obviously have the team, and they are stakeholders. They need to be informed about what's in and what's out of scope. They need to understand deadlines and what their tasking is. The team serves a client. That's the person who pays for you to be there. And not to get overly taxonomy about it, it's important that we start using terms consistently in the industry. I've actually adopted this largely from the International Association of Software Architects, ISA, but the client is the person or organization that pays me. They may not ever use the thing I build, but they are the client. The client in turn has users, and those users are the actual hands-on people who will take the tools and do important things. Frequently, those users have customers. So if you are a cashier at a grocery store, you may be the user of the register, but the customer is the person buying something. They're the one getting the benefit of whatever it is that you've built. We want the user to have benefit, but they want to have their customer have benefit. And if you really go further out, you have customers in communities and society at large. I'm a fan of serving the biggest possible group that I can. It's one of the things that keeps me in the job that I'm in, is I want to impact society. I want to be able to do work on natural disasters and help people regain their property rights after a war. I would like to be able to do projects where We're helping the tax system do the right things the right way to the right people. Pick whatever side of that you want to be on. I think that there are small systems that impact big communities. There wasn't that long ago where grocery stores didn't have scanners on every station. There was a cashier with a cash register, and they sat there and rang in each label. They had to look at every can and keep going and enter the right numbers. When the scanner hit, it was amazing. It helps the back office keep better inventory. It helps the people stocking the floor know what stock's coming in and out. It helps the customer get a more accurate sale with less errors. And also helps that customer engage with the store in the long run by having some sort of point system or whatever that store may offer up. It helps the cashier, who is no longer burdened with the physical labor, so to speak, of checking every can, and they can move much more quickly, which serves more customers. And it also serves the community, because by having more checkout lines move faster, everybody in that community the grocery is serving gets a better day. They move through more quickly. All of this sort of adds up over time, and you want to hit the biggest stakeholder group that you can, but you cannot neglect the ones below. So each of these stakeholders are required. Many of them are desired. The typical agile environment, it really focuses on that tight group around the solution itself. Again, nothing wrong with that. If everybody's playing nice, they're engaged, and they are constantly discussing things among themselves as the program evolves. Getting out to the greater good here is generally understanding with your customer and the user and the client, how are we going to message this thing out to a broader community? And software development today actually is required to engage this larger marketing motion with whomever you serve. It's important that they see value, and that value is because things are being used. Things being used have to be consumed. And to do that, you have to engage a large discussion. On big programs, I tend to do sort of $100 million programs and up. That happens because early in the system, along with the now famous DevOps cycle, we engage communications people and marketing people who actually work on ensuring that the documentation is consumable by the right target. They help us take the very technical speak we use to ensure correctness and turn it into very consumable language that might be very short, so that people can have an idea of what's coming towards them, an understanding of what they should use that thing for, and then an easy ramp to accept it once it's released. So don't think of stakeholders just as the ones in the moment, but you have to actually expand across this spectrum. Of course, the feedback itself isn't a single source of thing. There's a spectrum that goes easily from formal to informal and back. This tends to be the differentiation of formal things are predictable. They're done on a cycle. You know when they're going to happen. They are required and frequently contractual obligations where my feedback is put together as a work product and then delivered. Informal things are unscheduled. They're unbounded. They may just be a conversation in a hallway. They tend to have more conjecture in them. They're not as finite or certain. We get in some trouble sometimes when the wrong thing is used in the wrong place. I'm sure it's happened to you before, where informal feedback is looked at as quantitative, solid information. I've been in meetings, well, I've been in lots of meetings, but in meetings that towards the end, you know, people start to mill about, and you may be standing in the hallway and you're speaking to someone who's part of senior leadership. And in that conversation, you start to go back and forth about this thing's probably going to happen. And the outcome of that is going to be this impact to the team, and it's going to change something for somebody else. More junior people around you hear that, and they take this informal feedback as quantitative data being given to senior leadership, even though when you and that leader together in a hallway understand it's just chat. It becomes lore. And then these people might be willing to share that information with others, and it can actually create a feedback cycle that is not healthy. So it's important to know when you're doing what for whom. In this case, ideally, quantitative feedback only comes from formal feedback sessions where that information has had a time to go through the process. Informal feedback leading to qualitative opinions is still very valuable, but it has to be put forth that way. At the end, the two work together because informal feedback ultimately builds a hypothesis. That hypothesis gets tested, and the results of that test should be the formal feedback. So they are definitely related, and you do need both of them. But to have informal information presented in a formal way, no bueno, not good. That's going to drive people to make decisions that feel like they're high precision with really low precision information. I'll be the first to say, and I've said it on many presentations, that if someone asks me to guess at something, I tend to use prime numbers because it sounds like you measured it. Now, to say that there's 27% chance of something sounds a lot more interesting than 25. 25 sounds like a guess. For some reason, 27 sounds probably true. But that's a trick, and it's not a trick we want to have to use. Feedback should be precise when it is precise, and it should be wrapped in language about the qualitative nature when it isn't precise. We've talked to only 10 people, and given those 10 people, we believe this is the case, is great feedback. Saying, I ran a survey, and that survey resulted in a 27% response of X, misrepresents. It's not necessarily untrue, but it is informal feedback put into a qualitative state. Good. Informal feedback put into the quantitative state, yeah, bad. We want to make sure that stakeholders understand what it is they're getting, what kind of precision is related to it, and how that information could or should be used. But once you let it out, there is actually no control. But if you go to a stakeholder, either a senior leader or a team leader, or maybe it's just a user who's working with user tests, and say, this is a thing we have learned, you really need to continue that conversation. How will you use that information now that I've told you? Engage them not just in a broadcast, but in receipt too. So I'm going to go a little off my own script here for a second. For anybody who just noticed a giant change in the graphics, the first two slides were mine. The rest that you're about to see, honestly, I have pulled these images off the great internet. I've tried my best to put image credits everywhere if you're curious about them. I'm a terrible artist. All right, enough about that. It's important that we look at these things in a fairly scientific, math-based way, right? So stakeholder feedback feels like an exercise from an English class. I'm going to write down a narrative. I'm going to pass it to someone. They're going to read it. I'm a software architect by training. I like to decompose things. I like to hear what people say, the actual words, and break them down into noun-verb pairs and figure out what it is that they mean. It's important that we look at our constituencies and we use these skills to decompose whatever it is we're trying to express to them into a language they're going to understand. No matter who I speak to regularly, I find that there's a framework out there. It's called the Cynefin framework. I think it's Cynefin. I would tell you who made it up, but didn't put that in my notes and I've forgotten now. Anyway, it's been around a long time, but it basically says that there's complexity, there's complicated, there's simple, and there's chaos. It's just 4 quadrants. Simple things are where you apply knowledge you can find. So I can take someone who doesn't know much, hand them instructions, knowledge found, and they can do the work, comes out great. Complicated things require knowledge at hand. So you've seen enough, you've done enough, you've been trained, or you have manuals around, and you can take that knowledge at hand and solve a problem, a complicated problem. Great. Complexity is the last part of the spectrum. Complex things require knowledge and experience. Chances are the answer to it isn't there. Where simple is a known problem with a known solution. Complicated is a known problem with an unknown solution. Complex is an unknown problem with an unknown solution. And living in that complexity is what makes us valuable. If I understand a complex program, and my job is to keep everyone well informed, what I need to do is break it down into these parts, holding complexity at bay, make as much of it simple or complicated, so that as I go to share these things, the people receiving it have the least amount of work necessary to understand. There's always going to be some complex parts. There's no way around it. Complex programs have complex solutions. But communicating that to a stakeholder requires you to do the work so that they can consume it most easily. I think about the blocks on the screens and about how things sort of come apart, and it's a good representation of the different kinds of stakeholders that are required to make a whole thing. Now, Agile wants everybody to know everything. So ideally, every one of these blocks, we all hear the same thing, preferably at the same time, with a willingness to share immediately their feedback. It's noble. I can respect that. In a big program, you're talking about hundreds of people that vary from very junior developers to the CEO of a government agency. These things, they speak different languages. They want different pieces of that information, and they're willing to either trust or ignore some of the other parts. So you might say that the technical stakeholders, they have this need for specification with very narrow tolerances. They want exactness. You're going to give them a requirement, it's got to be clear. If you're going to give them feedback from a senior leadership meeting, it has to be precise because they really are going to care about the details. As you start moving up the chain, you start to hear things like, we have problems in the supply chain. Okay. Stakeholder gets that feedback, will start to use their staff to work through the bigger problem with whatever information you provide. If you say, we have a problem in the supply chain to one of the engineers who are working in defining the space, they'll say, which part of the supply chain? Who's the vendor for that? What's their workload requirement? What's their contract let us say? And you've got to really get down into precision because it's a completely different audience. So it's really important that you see all these parts as a piece of the whole. My general rule is I want to tell everybody everything, but I don't. I tell everybody what they need to know and largely what they want to know. But most people aren't going to hold it all in their head at once. It's complicated. That complication can be worked out. I can give it to you in writing so you can see all the different pieces. You don't have to remember it. But when we hit complexity and we're dealing with building, something that's highly scientific, like tracking the winds across smoke plumes in a battlefield, trying to think of something really obscure, that's not for everybody. The details of how that work are really buried down in engineering. The intent of it, the mission value for it, the strategic use of it, the tactical deployment of it, those are all different audiences that are going to get different pieces of this information. Last, it's really important to know where you are in the life cycle when you're communicating these things. Because if you're talking about ideation, then really what you're going to take to your stakeholders is a list of possibilities. We've considered these things. Here's some options. Let's talk it out. But if you're further down and you're down into like the initial build parts, you're going to talk about probabilities. We're doing this work. It's likely to be done in November. We're doing something and I need 6 to 8 more people to help me. All of these things tend to be fuzzy around the edges, but they're still smaller and discrete. The final delivery requires certainty. And in that moment, you should be talking about exactly what is. And if you wanted to do things like roadmaps or things that look forward into the future, you can go back sort of into the cone of uncertainty from the point that you're at. Here, when we release version 1 today, we know this to be true. V1 is likely to come out in the next quarter, and we're going to release every quarter for the next 3 years. And we would like to have these categories of things added onto our product as we go. Excellent communication. But coming in at the final delivery and saying, well, we haven't fully tested it, we're not sure what it does, generally considered poor form. So at that moment, your stakeholders want to know that they've got what they expected. And it shouldn't be a surprise because feedback up till then should have led them down into the other cone, right? From uncertain to more certain as you get to delivery. The goal is to provide quality feedback to the stakeholders, not just quantity. So decomposing for them is the job. I like to think that really high quality feedback, it can be broken down into this: predictable, transparent, timely, and actionable. Not a hard concept, but if you actually go and look at some things that have been sent to you, pick up a piece of email from somebody on your program in the last week who's trying to explain the state of affairs, and ask yourself, was it predictable? Did you expect it? Is it on time? Is it transparent? Do other people know about it? Or are they hiding something? Is it timely enough to do something about it? And is there something I should be doing? If you include these parts, you end up with a really substantive, high quality piece of feedback. So let's take a little bit one at a time. Predictable is about knowing what's next. The very best software people I've ever met can call the shot. They tend to get together as a team, see what they can do. They understand their speed and their velocity, their capability, and they can pretty much say, we expect to get this done by then. And there's a rhythm. Taking that kind of rhythm and bringing it all the way up to the stakeholder level, whether it's senior leadership or client, and saying, we're going to meet once a month to talk about X, the strategic things. We're going to meet every other week to talk about tactical things. We'll be meeting weekly to sum things up and provide a summary to anyone who cares to read it. And we'll meet every day as a team to make sure our status is known internally. That's a really common rhythm, but it makes things predictable. Scrums, the daily stand-up, really lean hard on this. And the agile environment has looked at communication as a necessary thing, but it's also mixed with everybody's involved. So there's not a lot of broadcast outside of Scrum by design. I think that in larger programs, particularly, people aren't going to have the ability to attend all the meetings. So simple things nowadays, we do a lot of calls and videos like this, and everything gets recorded. The records of those calls are attached with notes from those calls and are all posted together. Anybody can go back in their calendar, reopen the meeting, and replay it at their leisure. This is particularly useful for globally distributed teams. Time zones can be stressful. Being able to reduce that stress is the goal of predictability. Ultimately, it creates a series of time boxes. And within each time box, you know you have to be ready to communicate by that moment in time. And it asks for the stakeholders that need to be well-informed to be prepared to receive it in that cycle. Similarly, it allows the stakeholders to do one of their favorite things: tell others they can defer. Someone at a senior level may be in a meeting and someone says, do you know the status of X? And their response will be, we're going to have a meeting in a week and a half, and we plan to cover that. And that could be a great moment for them to hold at bay something they honestly didn't know. But the predictability of it, having preset the schedule and hopefully acting upon it in a predictable way, allows them to reliably make that comment and then follow up in a week and a half after the meeting with the new information. Last, predictable means hierarchical in most environments. Lower teams meet frequently. Big senior leadership meets less frequently. It's kind of a tradition. I'm not always a fan of it, but it works. People who run large businesses and government agencies are frequently unavailable, and therefore getting on their calendar may be something you can only do every 4, 6, or 8 weeks. If you need to communicate to them more frequently, you just have to use a different mechanism. We will send you a newsletter every 4 weeks. You'll get an email summarizing end of week every Monday from last week. You can make it predictable and still get it with them. The hierarchical nature drives accuracy. Ideally, the low-level team meets, all agrees on a thing. It's passed up to the mid-level teams, let's say enterprise-wide. They all agree on the same things, and it goes up to senior leadership as a singular voice. That's ideal. It's also ideal that I just sort of personally hate status reports. I think people seeking satisfaction aren't involved. If you want to know what's going on, be involved. Then you're part of the stand-ups, you're part of the workload, you're part of the conversation over lunch. Everybody knows. Doesn't work great on large teams. On large teams, you really do need to have the ability for a lower team to inform an upper team. Just as a cautionary tale, I did a system for the US Navy many years ago. It was about building battleships. Battleships are what's called an ACAT-1 program. There's a lot of money involved. People worry. The system was going to watch the project plan, literally Microsoft project. And if it slipped a little, it would inform the project lead, just send a notification. If it slipped more than that, it would inform the program lead, who in theory would get a hold of the project lead, work out the problem, and it would all go away. If it slipped too much further than that, it would inform the person who was the sponsor of the program, who had to go before Congress if something bad happens. And if it slipped way out, it would automatically inform the congressional committee. This was a brilliant piece of automation, even if I say so myself. It was really hard to work out. And I had learned a lesson very early in my career with it. If you make a tool that informs on people, they will lie to the tool. So nothing ever slipped. They just didn't report it. Stakeholder feedback can be really, really valuable, but it has to actually occur. So the feedback sessions where everybody participates, it's not just tell me what's going on. The question is, will you have feedback for feedback? Most of these things that get published are one-way broadcasts. They'll be predictable. It's Monday morning. I can see what happens. But then what happens next? Do you allow them an opportunity to respond? And if so, is it to the small group or to the big group? Is there a large publication channel? How does that happen and how onerous is it? Ultimately, that turns into transparency. I don't know why my throat's so dry today. Transparency is about not just sharing, but sharing wildly with everybody. It's about who gets to know what you're talking about. Some organizations, they live on a need to know. Don't share. That's kind of their rule. Other organizations live with anybody can know. Always share. Great. There's a third variant of this, which is a little weird, and I've only come across it once, which is make sure to tell. Like, not only must you share, but you must share this way with those people. Weird. Prior to 9/11, the US government, who I've done a lot of work for, had a need to know policy. If you had information that was about your program, it was usually in a box, and no one outside of that box needed to know. You did your work, and the outcome was what people saw. This is actually more common than it would seem in regular software development. We talk about being outcome driven. We talk about being milestone based. And what happens between the milestones is our dark secret. We think that there's a need to know only. You should be in the team working, you get to know. Outside the team, we'll tell you about things when we're ready. Everything changed. 9/11, bad days. We went to this need to share across the government. And that sudden shift caused entire program infrastructure to change the way they handle stakeholder management, because stakeholders were no longer contained within their box. Stakeholders could be as far away as other government agencies' small programs. And the ability to push and pull data about stuff became a huge effort. And transparency was about finding equality among these three opportunities. Don't tell anybody, tell everybody, and tell exactly these people. Balancing that is what makes for a transparent piece of feedback. I like to see this mostly as a push-pull environment. For people that I know I have to share with, I will push to them. For people who I believe should know, but are actually too hard to schedule or too hard to get to, we make things published. And we say, here's the pointer. You can go there anytime you want and see the current status. Usually these are where you see the live dashboards of stuff. You don't have to feed it. It's not a system of record, but it's a window into what's going on. And stakeholders' feedback should include, and if you want more detail, click here. And today's era of websites everywhere, it's just not that hard to provide people more detail to click down into if they want it. Ultimately, you control the narrative. You decide in the feedback, when you're talking across all these audiences, who's the hero and who's the villain. The tone that you use in the conversation is really going to make a difference. When you use your words, and you need to use words carefully because words matter, saying that we have accomplished most of something is very different than there's part of this we haven't finished yet, although they are sort of the glass half empty, glass half full conversation, just in feedback. Being able to be clear and qualitative when necessary and quantitative when appropriate helps solve some of this. You want this to be about the facts, not the people, not the project. It's important that there is truth and it is clear, but particularly when transparency gets very wide. People will be reading whatever you wrote without the context. Although what you say and to who you say it and when is ultimately the greatest piece of concern for you. If you have a declarative tone, people are just going to believe you because that's your job. So let's talk about timely. Timely and actionable they're tightly coupled. I would usually do this all in one slide, but I had an hour to fill, so I figured I broke it apart. Timely feedback has three, I guess, unsurprising timelines. There are things that occur recent or before. There are things that are in flight right now, present, and of course, things that are likely to happen next. High quality feedback is going to put all three of these things around a fact. So you can say, we were able to take attendance in 10 classrooms today. Interesting, solid feedback. It's measured, it's got context, but it's incomplete. It'd be more complete if you were to say, we can take attendance in 10 classrooms today. For the last 3 weeks, we've only been able to do 2. Given the systems that we've put in place, we think we have a goal in the next 2 months of being able to do 1,000 classrooms without any problem. Much more interesting feedback. Historical context allows to show you the progress. Current is quantitative, so it's measured and clear. And future is a little fuzzier, but it's showing that there's a track of work to do. And that information is now consumable by anybody without a whole lot of error. Somebody may say, you can only do 10 classrooms. Well, that's nothing. Others might say, well, we only needed 12. That's great. You've done 10. It's up to you to couch this thing in a way that people get that feedback and in the right context, so that it's really high quality feedback. The other problem is that if something is happening right now, you can report what led up to it and the impact of the future. But if something is about to happen, you can't report right now, and you can only guess about future plans. So your fact moves through this timeline too. Most of us will do our best, depending on the stress of the circumstance, to give people the right information. There's an instinct to warn too soon. We see this thing coming and, oh my God, this bad thing's about to happen, or it'll be great, we'll make that deadline, no problem. You might be crying wolf because we don't know yet. It's not yet a fact. If you have tests that said I did 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, and 32, and it's a real linear track, using the math, you might say, we believe it will go to this point. Great. But if you don't have the math, don't predict too soon, because no one really knows. Warning too late, of course, is the other side. No one cares at that point. The bad thing happened, then you walk in the room and go, it's coming. Nope, it's here. It's happened. And your credibility tanks. Stakeholders want to know in advance, but they want to know this sort of Goldilocks timing. You want to elevate to people soon enough that it's doable and actionable, but not too soon, when it's too late to do anything. It's a very difficult balance. But again, if you set up these sort of multiple channels, both push-pull, over time, rhythmically across your population, odds are people are going to get what they need when they need it. So let's go to actionable. High quality feedback is a problem and a solution. That's the ideal. We don't tend to live in an ideal world, and bad things happen, but it's trite. And the old saying, don't come to me with problems if you don't have solutions. It's important that the recommendations that we're bringing in are either, let me be a little bit more specific. There's 3 ways you can report actionable things. I can say, I have signal about an issue, and then wait. And hopefully somebody else picks up the point and says, let's do something about it. This is not great. It is truly feedback. You have provided information. It is actionable, but it's a little incomplete at that point. Option 2, we present the issue and we offer up a series of options. This thing's about to happen. It's likely to be A, B, or C, so we need to do either 1, 2, or 3. That's pretty good. Now I've brought in some opportunity and I'm leaving it to whoever I'm speaking to make choices. So instead of them having to go do research and figure it out, if they believe in the background that we've put on the table, hopefully they'll pick from 1, 2, or 3 and we move on. Not bad. It's feedback, right? I saw a thing, I reported it. I went past that and I gave it context and some action. But the gold standard of feedback for me, I've got a problem. And I'm going to provide you a recommended solution and the trade-offs that went into making that decision and the predicted outcome for that, for all the options, and why the one I've chosen to recommend is the lowest risk or the highest yield or whatever it is that makes it the right choice. That's the goal. All of these things leading up to do this. You're telling a stakeholder what you are intending to do, and they're trusting you. Now, that trust obviously needs to be built in advance. If you go and make predictions for outcomes, you have to make them consistently true. So when you do it again in this context, they still believe you. You have to have delivered well on whatever you've been doing in the past for them to believe your decision-making is sound. But that's all personal. We want to deal in the facts. If you wrap each of these recommendations in its facts, the quantitative nature of them, and you represent their outcomes the same way, then making a choice isn't much of a choice. It's following the facts to the ultimate end. I admit all feedback does not have this course of action attached, but it is the gold standard to be really clear and have something they can do about it. Otherwise, I'm not sure why you're telling anyone. I get to be in the senior leadership level of feedback all the time. And sometimes people will say, well, there's a holiday coming, so next week we're going to have 6 people off. And I just stand there and nod. Like, true. So what I really want to know is, because you're going to have 6 people off for the holiday, which is the right thing to do, we see throughput dropping down to a certain point that we're going to have to move out a milestone or a gate, or we've brought in other people who aren't going to take the holiday to take their place. There's something else after that that makes it solid, useful feedback. Failing that, I smile and nod. And then wonder why. Why did you tell me? What is it I don't know? Who do I have to find to figure that out? And I hate that kind of feedback. It's work for me. And ideally, your stakeholders, they've given you tasks and you're reporting up so that you'll do the work and they don't have to. All of this really does have a structure. It's not random. Facts matter, but the story gives them meaning. And within the story that you're using to tell that structure, you really need to use logical constructs. It's not all if this, then that. It's great when it is, and you can prove it. That's the simplest case. It's often If it's this, there may be that, or these other things. Really, really common because the world is full of multiple right answers. The last is the most difficult. I've looked into this and it keeps looping. I do this thing, this other thing happens, I'm back to the first one, then back to the second one, and it repeats. When I find something like that in the story I'm telling, I probably shouldn't have said that. I probably should have figured out how to break out of that loop first and made that piece of feedback the kind of thing that says, we're doing this thing because there was this logical loop. And it's not uncommon in most environments to find something that happens that causes this repetitious thing. The sine wave of badness. Team A does a thing that causes team B to do the thing that causes team A to do the thing. It never ends. Sequencing what we say and making a story around it gives people something they can hold on to. If you're doing work for disaster recovery, disaster response, I did have the great joy of replacing the lead for our disaster response team for 6 months at the beginning of this year. Learned a lot about war. Turns out war is bad. But there are a lot of things that have to happen. People make requests for help. You have to figure out whether or not you can provide the help. You have to figure out how to get a team together very quickly and then field that to a solution, telling everybody along the way, the people who request it, the people who represent, the people who be impacted, the sponsors of the program, the people who are paying for it or not. All of that has to come out of this as facts very, very quickly. So you've got to be able to give people a shared mental model. That tends to be the story. If a school system is taking attendance, most people are familiar with the basic storyline. My child or others go to school, they go to class, attendance is taken, we know whether or not they're there. The mystery piece is that attendance goes to some county or government agency so that they fund the school. Okay, if we all understand that, then we have the ability to take the newfound feedback. We're able to take attendance, but we're not yet able to submit to the government and put it in context. Well, if I don't get it to the government, I don't get paid. The school doesn't get funded, there won't be enough teachers, bad things will follow. Or, okay, if we can't do that, what are my options to ensure that that happens? And what's the cost of not doing it now? And how do I recoup it? It drives the conversation further. That story matures over time as more and more people get to hear it. And as more and more people engage in that story, you get more facts. But you have to boil out all the fear, uncertainty, and doubt and get down to if this, then that. If it's not this, then this other thing happens. We're always going to take the stories back to their core, back to the thing they can hold on to. At a more detailed level, we're talking about the dreaded measures and metrics. Stakeholder feedback tends to be in response to some goal. Being able to understand if we've met that goal, if I give the feedback, did they hear me? Did they care? It can be complicated that way. People will sit and they'll read the thing that you put out that's a summary of the event or events, and then set aside. Thank you for that. You've given me feedback. And then it sort of stops. Part of the job of producing high quality feedback is being able to follow up on that feedback to see if it was consumed, to see if it helped them. Should it be changed or not? Is there the impact of the feedback on others outside of your realm of work? If you're working with a small team on a large program, you sent feedback up the chain that this thing would perform better or worse than something expected. What is the impact on the overall enterprise? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what will you do with the feedback that comes back to you? All these things have to be boiled down to metrics. Towards the beginning, and then of course, revisiting throughout the life cycle, you can establish a handful, 4, 6, 10 metrics that have a target and a baseline and a change. That is, I have the number of things off of a production line. I want to produce 1,000 an hour. I currently produce 100 an hour, and increasing that number is better. Now, the last part seems a little weird. But the truth is, some numbers, less is better, right? The number of defects produced per hour would be a good example. Being a public sector guy, I tend to deal in lives, right? We want fewer people to die or be injured. Number less, better. Sometimes it's more. Revenue goes up. We want to track it as going up. But if you don't have a baseline, you can't tell how close you are or aren't to success. The agile world talks about iterations or increments, and each of those on their own is inherently good. I need to produce 100 features. I'm at 80 features. Sounds great. If I'm at 80 features and I've got a week left to go, probably not great. Somewhere along the way, we need to see how many I expected to be done at what point and how close to that baseline variance I am. Now, honestly, this is getting terribly close to earned value. I actually like earned value management on large programs, but the small lightweight form in Agile is your backlog and your burn down charts. They're well-known Agile metrics that still work. They're essentially doing earned value. Are we where we expected to be? If I get way off, too good or too bad, then bringing it back is going to be just too hard. Underlying all these things is a simple pattern. For any given thing, can I place it in the context of time, know its impact, the action that needs to be taken, and the consequence of taking it or not? So here we are, 12 slides later, almost an hour in. This is really the only slide that matters. If you can do this thing for each and everything you report, you're going to have really high quality, actionable feedback that's well understood. So with that, I think I'm supposed to say that concludes the presentation. At this point, I'll hand it back to Susan.
Thank you. We do have a few questions here. We have one from Belinda. Stephen, any recommendations on ensuring you are sharing enough on any one project when dealing with multiple high-stake projects?
Yeah, balance is hard when you start spreading across things. If all of the projects are within one enterprise, with one program, it's not too terribly hard. You need to have equality across them all based on the risk they are managing. If I have a program that's dealing with creating infrastructure for an enterprise, that's all the networking and stuff, and then doing what they do for a living, selling things, and then another program which is accounting for it, the HR back office type of work. It's pretty easy to say, if I don't have that underlying infrastructure, nothing else works. I better report on that stuff with a higher degree of detail up front. But over time, that's going to shift away from that as it becomes reliable into, can I deliver on the business? The back office things, they are important, but probably not as time limited, so that you can feather them together. Knowing that you've done that well is about expanding the conversation and the feedback you provide to include discussions of risk and whether or not you're managing risk well for them. And that's an ask that you can just hope to get decent feedback about. Most people who have a risk love to tell you about it, and they really want to hear how to make it go away. So being unbalanced does generate risk for them. If I have this really great financial system coming up, but I can't yet connect any of my businesses, the business should probably say that's not where you should focus. Our risk is in not selling things, and we have an underlying problem to solve.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. And with that, Stephen, we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's always fun.